Hello, I'm Haikal. Today, I shall explain about the trust and will, which is the foundation in equity and trust. As we go further, we will go in depth in regards to testamentary capacity. In short, I will describe the difference between the mental resolve required for making a will and the mental resolve required to making a trust. Moving forward also, I will also discuss if these differences actually make sense in the real world, or in other words, justified by assessing some key research articles. Let's try to visualize a confused old man. He has no idea what day it is, but he knows his children, and he wants them to have his home when he dies. He is sane enough to write a will, as can be seen in Equity and Trust, but if the same man attempts to place the same house into a trust today, the law may state that he is not capable. Therefore, we will view these differences in this presentation. To begin with, let us define the terms. A will is a testamentary instrument. From a legal standpoint, by a case established in Sinch and Sinch, a will is ambulatory and revocable, which means that it is without any life and it can remove no rights until the testator takes his last breath. This illustrates that the will is a testamentary gift and the law is generous enough in interpreting it with a spirit of testamentary freedom. The principle found in Banks and Goodfellow, where the propounder of the will must prove a fourfold test. The question comes first, whether there is a proof that the testator understands that this document reflects a final deposition of his life's work. Secondly, is there a rational understanding of the assets? Further, the expert explains that it is very often to take into account for the actions that have the meaning beyond the will itself to determine who is the identity of the beneficiary. Additionally, on the third step, the testator must be able to understand and appreciate the claims of those who would naturally receive an inheritance from him. And lastly, there should be no disorder of mind that could affect the affections of the testator. In Malaysian position, the Federal Court in Udam Singh and Indah Kau explicitly adopted this bank standard. The court clarified that when we value testamentary freedom, the legal burden of proof remains strictly on the person proposing the will to prove that the testator possessed a sound mind, memory, and understanding at the material time. However, that is where we need to realize the foundations of a will. The Goodfellow test is actually an extremely old, with no little change to its test until now. To further elaborate, the Goodfellow test concentrates on psychosis and delusions, the two main concerns in 1870. However, today, the main problem is actually dementia. The expert points out that there is no similarity whatsoever between dementia markers and psychosis, but that the number of dementia cases currently surpasses that of psychosis cases in will challenges. Therefore, there is a question like, is it legally responsible to use a 150-year-old psychosis test to evaluate a modern brain suffering from cognitive decline? The gap often results a tension between a medical and legal profession in the understanding of the meaning of the capacity in the practice. However, as for the modern days, we must also be mindful that there are understated traps in an approach of using a new statute to replace the Goodfellow test. Why is that? It is because the banks has captured something that modern medicine would not be able to do, which is emotional competence and authenticity. Further, a modern clinical assessment may be that an elderly person is not rational, but the bank's test enables the court to take into account a person's impression from their past, family, and personal values. Moreover, if this was not so, the property would be taken by the crude measure of the intestacy rules, and in many cases, it could surprise the common sense of the mankind. More so, there has to be the Malaysian point of view that we need to also take into consideration. For Section 3 of the Wills Act 1959, it only requires a sound mind, but it is highlighted in a recent case study where Malaysians do delay will writing until they are physically frail. The key here is that the Malaysians delay preparation of their estate until they are physically and mentally weak, often for example such as COVID-19 outbreak. In my opinion, if the courts in this country are to apply onto the scientific medical test, then that would be robbing the majority of our people and leaving around 8 billion worth of assets in unclaimed limbo. Thus, the difference still exists, and it is a policy call that must be made in Malaysia, that we must continue to lower the bar so that the people will act before it is too late in making their last wishes to be known. Now, in stark contrast, by the declaration of Inter Vivos Trust, not only is someone making a plan for the future, they are creating a living obligation that alters their legal standing in the here and now. Hence, the difference between a will and a trust is that a trust is a doing of giving, whereas a will is a promising to give. The definition of a trust is that the creation of dual ownership, where it comprises the legal title goes to the trustee for the management and the equitable interest goes to the beneficiary for enjoyment. Furthermore, in Malaysia, it is regulated with the Contracts Act 1950. In sections 11 and 12, a settler's ability to make a rational judgment about the effects of their actions on them is required. In my opinion, it is a much greater challenge than a will. Why? As established in the Paul and Paul, once a trust is properly constituted, it is not revocable anymore. Thus, the constitution of the property and the transfer of the legal title away from the settler vouchsafes to equity that the volunteer is not able to obtain the property. Further, in Milroy and Lord, where it established that the settler must do everything necessary to transfer the legal title. But why is the need for such clarity in the law? One of the experts cautioned us of the dangerous allure of the simple solutions. This requires boardroom rigor. The expert argues that a trust can be more than a division of ownership, and it is a complicated legal relationship in which the settler seeks the right to control their own assets. If we were to let someone with limited capacity to sign a trust deed, then we would be entrusting them to sign away their life savings without any protection. More so, this regard is also reflected in the Malaysian law. In 1 Naimah and 1 Muhammad Nawawai, the court emphasized that while formalities for trust over the land might be vary between the states, the certainty of intention remains a non-negotiable requirement. Hence, the settler must have the full mental capacity to clearly intend to divest themselves of their interests. Thus, the larger capacity will be a safeguard for the living grantor in that he or she must know what they are doing when they search and discriminate in using the instrument. On a deeper level, we can further look at the psychological weight of this act. There is a distinction between belief and deciding to trust. If someone trusts another person to keep the property, that person's trust in the other person can be considered a direct and immediate decision. Moreover, the level of trust is dependent on the trustworthiness of the person. More on that, a mentally frail settler cannot properly assess the trustworthiness of his trustee. Further, a strict capacity test will ensure that only a well-informed decision to give away assets is made, and not a blink of the eye one. Last but not least, the law does act as a shield, where we may see from the local Malaysian context. In Malaysia, the hibah trusts are now become somewhat popular and familiar, especially amongst the Muslim community. The hibah are not just a simple gift for the family anymore, but they are being sold by big banks as wealth management offerings. The requirement for contractual capacity becomes even more satisfactory and justified when the trusts are looked upon as commercial products. As the experts suggest, today, trusts are loose from the basic land or probate trust, which has now turned to be more complex and being a sophisticated global tool. Further, as the Islamization of the trust is employed as a succession planning tool in Malaysia, the only thing preventing an elderly person and a predatory wealth manager that wants to lock into their assets into a permanent and a complicated structure is a strict capacity test. Is there any justification for these differences? On the face of it, a tough critic could say the law does not actually make sense and it is inconsistent. Why should a testator be sane enough to be able to sign away a million ringgit estate via a will, but be mentally void if he wishes to place the same estate into a trust? It is an approach that it seems to be logically flawed. But as we look for the justifications, it is actually not a mistake. It is a strategic split of the norms between two interests, the testamentary freedom and the settler protection. The first hurdle is proving the higher contractual requirement for trust. A trust is a lot more dangerous than a will. A will is an actionless document. It does not have a life until it is no longer there, whereas a trust is an act of giving. When the deed is signed, the settler has no legal title anymore. To further elaborate, psychological cause says that the process of choosing to trust is a conscious, weighty mental process that is much more dangerous than merely believing in an eventual outcome. In addition, the law has to be strict gatekeeper, as a trust is a third type of legal relationship, which is very much irreversible. One example is that the lower capacity standard is a green light to elder financial abuse in Malaysia, where trusts such as hibah are now sold as commercial banking products. So the higher hurdle is legitimate. It is a safeguard for the living for them not to become destitute before. The other threshold is wills, which its lower requirement is based on the autonomy principle. Academic evidence suggests that the 150-year-old Banks and Goodfellow test is better than the current laws, as it places greater emphasis on emotional skills and genuine expressions. This explains that the law recognizes that a person can have a frail body or be forgetful but remain the same person. Be aware of who he loves and what he owns. If the capacity requirement of the wills has increased of that of trust, the old people would be disenfranchised, and in the Malaysian context, where more than 8 billion ringgit Malaysia worth of assets are already immobilized because of poor estate planning. Furthermore, one of the suggested flexible tests is a social safety valve. This test may enable the law to uphold the last will of the dying without imposing a strict boardroom level cognitive test on them. However, a critical examination would be incomplete without the no. The law is committing scientific ignorance by refusing to let go of a 1870 test as provided by the medical researchers. Further, the Goodfellow test was created to identify Victorian psychosis. But the greatest problem in the modern world is dementia, which strikes a completely different path on the cognitive level. Furthermore, those critics state that this inconsistency makes for a litigation trap since we have a lower standard for the will and we are letting the litigation to run up the cost of the estate after the testator is dead. Therefore, the question which could be raised is it freedom when the law permits a confused person to sign something which will only be the cause of his family suffering in the court for the next 10 years? Finally, we realize that the law is not consistent between these two standards. To me, by maintaining this capacity deficit, equity is actually doing an adequate balance between two conflicting human rights, namely the right to be free in death and the right to be protected in life. When we consider the acts beyond the level of merely a clinical diagnosis, we can actually observe the reality from the situation from an economic and social point of view. So what happens in the end? Does the difference actually make sense? To me, I believe the answer is yes. But this is not for a medical justification, but a public policy justification. The law must be the guardian of the settler of a trust, since a trust is a performance of giving, living obligation that can leave a person destitute or homeless when he still needs his assets. On the other hand, the law is a friend to the testator of a will, since a will is ambulatory, meaning it does not cost anything to the testator during his lifetime, and embodies the testator's last and true wishes. But to me, sanity, in the eyes of the law, is not an absolute medical death term. A sliding scale is used and it is based completely on the consequences. Equity doesn't need to be heal anything, it just needs to be fair. In principle, it is a fair thing to be hard on the living and soft on the dying. At the bottom line, the role of capacity is just the people thing. We have to leave our possessions safe while we are here and our legacy intact when we are not. So that's all from me. Thank you.